The mud of the Aegis training grounds had a unique, proprietary stench. It was a cocktail of churned earth, old sweat, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of spent brass. It clung to boots, uniforms, and the back of the throat, a constant, gritty reminder that this place was designed to grind you down to your component parts and see what, if anything, was worth rebuilding. Into this mire of controlled chaos stepped Alara Vance. She moved with an economy of motion that was unsettling. Where other new arrivals hauled their duffels with grunting effort, she carried hers as if it were an extension of her own arm. She was an anomaly. The other candidates for this elite selection course were slabs of muscle and bone, their histories written in scar tissue and the predatory confidence of their posture. They were loud, their camaraderie forged in boasts and backslapping bravado. Alara, by contrast, was built along quieter lines. She was of average height, with a lean frame that suggested the endurance of a marathon runner rather than the explosive power of a breacher. Her face was unremarkable, her features placid and difficult to read, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, regulation bun. She looked less like a special operations candidate and more like an archivist who had taken a wrong turn at the quartermaster's office. This discrepancy did not go unnoticed. A thick-necked recruit named Jax, who carried himself as the pack's self-appointed alpha, watched her approach the barracks. He nudged his closest associate, Kale, a man whose jaw seemed permanently clenched. "Look at that," Jax murmured, his voice a low rumble of amusement. "Recruitment must be scraping the bottom of the barrel. Think she can even lift a rifle?" Kale snorted. "Maybe it's for the admin pool. Someone's got to file the paperwork for our medals." The laughter that followed was quiet but sharp, meant to be overheard. It was a test, the first of many. Alara gave no indication she had heard them. She proceeded to her assigned bunk, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the layout, the exits, the weight distribution of the steel support beams. It was an automatic, unconscious assessment. She placed her bag on the thin mattress and began to unpack with a methodical precision that was almost hypnotic. Each item had its place. Socks were rolled to a uniform tightness. Her single spare uniform was folded into a perfect, crisp square, and her cleaning kit was laid out as if for a formal inspection. Her movements were fluid and silent, devoid of any wasted energy. This quiet competence was more irritating to Jax and his cohort than any open defiance would have been. Weakness they understood. Arrogance they understood. This silent, meticulous self-containment was alien. It was a language they didn't speak. "Hey, bookworm!" Jax called out, his voice louder this time, drawing the attention of the entire bay. "You know this is the sharp end of the spear, right? Not a library." Alara finished aligning her boots perfectly beneath her bunk. She turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes were a flat, neutral gray, and they held his for a second longer than was comfortable. She didn't smile, didn't scowl. She simply looked at him, an act of pure observation. Then, without a word, she turned back to her task. The dismissal was absolute. It wasn't hostile. It was indifferent, as if he were a piece of furniture or a crack in the wall, noted and then disregarded. A low growl rumbled in Jax's chest. He took a step forward, but Kale placed a hand on his arm. "Not yet," Kale cautioned. "Rorik will break her. Let the gunny do the work." Jax relaxed, a cruel smirk replacing his anger. Kale was right. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik was the chief instructor, a man carved from granite and fury. He viewed modern soldiering with suspicion and had a particular disdain for anyone who didn't fit his mold of a warrior. Big, aggressive, and loud. Alara Vance was a walking contradiction to everything he valued. Her time here would be short and brutal. Later that afternoon, the candidates were assembled on the parade ground, the gray sky threatening a cold, miserable rain. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik stood before them, his posture as rigid as the flagpole behind him. He was a relic from an older, harder war, his face a roadmap of scars and his voice a gravel pit. "Look around you," he began, his voice carrying without the need for amplification. "Look at the person to your left. Now look to your right. In 3 months, most of them will be gone. washed out, broken, sent back to whatever REMF unit they crawled out of. His eyes, chips of flint, swept across the formation. They paused, just for a moment, on Alara. His gaze was heavy with disapproval, a physical weight of skepticism. This is not a place for the weak. This is not a place for the hesitant. This is a crucible. We will burn away your fat, your fear, and your ego. We will find your breaking point, and we will push you past it. If you are found wanting, you will be discarded. If you are worthy, you will be remade in fire and steel. Do you understand me? A chorus of "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant," thundered back. Alara's voice was not among them. She stood perfectly still, her expression unchanging, her focus on the man speaking. To Rorik, her silence was insolence. To her, it was simple efficiency. The question was rhetorical. A vocal response was a waste of breath. This was the first of many fundamental disconnects between her and the world she now inhabited. For Jax and his friends, it was just more proof. She didn't belong. The crucible was waiting, and they were all eager to watch her burn. The cold rain began to fall, plastering their thin shirts to their skin, but Alara didn't seem to notice. She just stood, watching, waiting for the real test to begin. The dismissal of Alara Vance was not a single event, but a campaign of 1,000 small cuts, administered daily by her peers and tacitly endorsed by the instructional staff. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik set the tone. During the initial physical assessment, a brutal circuit of weighted carries, rope climbs, and sprints, he shadowed her, his voice a constant, grating critique. "Move it, Vance. My grandmother can carry more than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. He'd bark as she hauled 2 heavy ammo cans. Her technique focused on skeletal alignment and core strength rather than the raw bicep power the others used. She didn't grunt or strain visibly, her face a mask of concentration. She finished the course in the middle of the pack, her time respectable but not exceptional. To Rorik, this was damning evidence. He saw only a lack of explosive effort, not the deep well of energy conservation she was practicing. "Mediocre," he grunted to his second-in-command, Sergeant Chan. "No heart, no aggression. She won't last the week." Chan, a younger, more observant man, watched Alara calmly rehydrating, her breathing already back to a normal rhythm while bigger men were still heaving for air. "I don't know, Gunny," he said quietly. "Her recovery time is off the charts. It's like she's not even trying." "That's the problem, Sergeant," Rorik snapped. "She's not. This is a place for lions, not sheep." The lions, as Rorik called them, took their cue. In the mess hall, Jax and his four-man clique, Kale, Ivan, a lanky, sharp-faced man named Reese, and a brute named Olek, made it a point to isolate her. If she sat at a table, they would sit at the far end, leaving a wide, deliberate gap. They would speak just loud enough for her to hear, their words dripping with condescension. "Heard Rorik made her restack the entire sandbag wall this morning," Ivan said one evening, shoveling food into his mouth. "Said her corners weren't neat enough. Probably used a protractor. She probably enjoyed it," Jack sneered, not bothering to lower his voice. "A nice, quiet, orderly task. No need to get your hands dirty with anything that fights back. Right, Vance?" Alara continued eating, her movements deliberate. She picked up her fork, speared a piece of boiled potato, and brought it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, her gaze fixed on the wall behind Jax's head. She offered no reaction, no flicker of anger or hurt. Her calm was a mirror, reflecting their own ugliness back at them, and it drove them mad. Her refusal to engage was a denial of their power over her. The academic portions of the training offered no respite. In classes on battlefield tactics and strategy, Alara was silent. When instructors posed complex hypothetical scenarios, other candidates would jump to offer aggressive textbook solutions. Jax was always the first, proposing overwhelming force as the answer to every problem. Alara would simply listen, her head tilted slightly, a small notebook open in front of her. She rarely wrote anything down. One instructor, A visiting captain from intelligence tried to draw her out. "Cadet Vance, we have an enemy sniper team pinning down a friendly unit in a dense urban environment. Limited assets, high risk of collateral damage. What's your play?" Alara looked up. The entire class turned to watch, anticipating a fumbled answer. "What is the weather?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The captain blinked. "Standard. Clear day, light wind from the west. Building materials. Mostly concrete and rebar. Some older brick structures. Time of day. 1,400 hours." She paused for a beat. "You don't engage the sniper team. You engage the spotter. At 1,400 hours, the sun is in the west-southwest. Any competent team will set up with the sun at their back, using east-facing windows. Their primary exfiltration route will be away from the sun. The sniper is the weapon. The spotter is the brain. You disable the brain. Use a two-man team. One creates a diversion, a smoke grenade, a flashbang, on the north side of the target building to draw the sniper's attention. The second, positioned to the south, has a 10-second window to neutralize the spotter, who will be focused on the diversion. The sniper is now blind. You have broken the team's ODA loop. Then you can deal with the shooter." The room was silent. The captain stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. Her answer wasn't just good. It was flawless, accounting for variables none of the others had even considered. It was the answer of a seasoned professional, not a recruit. Jax broke the silence with a scoff. "Easy to say in a classroom. Bet she'd freeze up the second a real bullet flew past her head." The captain shot him a glare, but the moment was broken. The other cadets shuffled, their preconceived notions warring with what they had just heard. Rorik, who had been observing from the back of the room, scowled. To him, this wasn't impressive. It was sterile, academic. It lacked fire. It was the thinking of a coward, looking for a trick instead of a fight. He saw her intellect not as an asset, but as a liability, a substitute for the grit and raw courage he believed was the true mark of a warrior. The dismissal only deepened, hardening from simple skepticism into a concrete conviction. She was a theorist, a thinker, a talker, and in his world that made her a liability. He resolved to prove it. The crisis arrived under the guise of advanced training. The module was CQC, close quarters combat. The air in the facility known as the Kill House was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The walls were scarred black from thousands of simulated breaches, the floors slick with condensation. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik stood before the assembled candidates, a predatory gleam in his eye. This was his church, and the sacrament was violence. "Today we separate the men from the boys," he growled, his gaze sweeping the room and pointedly ignoring Alara. "We learn the brutal math of combat. In a room there is no distance. There is no time. There is only you and him. One of you walks out. Today, you will run the gauntlet." He gestured towards a long, narrow corridor constructed within the Kill House, filled with obstacles, doorways, and blind corners. "You will move from this end to that. You will be engaged by 3 opponents. Your job is to neutralize them and reach the exit. Your opponents are senior cadets. They will not go easy on you. This is full contact. The pain is your teacher. The first failure is your last. Is that clear?" A ragged chorus of affirmations answered him. One by one, the candidates ran the gauntlet. The results were predictable. Jax, fueled by raw aggression, barreled through like a wild bull. He took a staggering number of hits, his padded uniform marking simulated wounds across his chest and limbs, but he disabled his opponents through sheer brute force, ending the run bruised, breathless, but successful. Rorik clapped him on the shoulder, a rare sign of approval. "That's it. That's the fire I want to see." Others were not so lucky. Many were overwhelmed in the first few seconds, their textbook techniques crumbling under the pressure of real, painful resistance. They were dragged out, their expressions a mixture of shame and shock. Alara watched each run, her face impassive. She wasn't watching the fighters. She was watching their feet, their balance, the way they shifted their weight before a strike. She was memorizing the layout of the corridor, noting how the light fell, where the shadows were deepest. Finally, only a few candidates remained. Rorik held up a hand, a grim smile on his face. We're going to change the final scenario. Combat is rarely a one-on-one affair. It's about teamwork. It's about overwhelming the enemy. He pointed at Jax, who was nursing a split lip but grinning with pride. Jax, your team leader. Take Kale, Ivan, Reese, and Olek. The 5 of you will be the opposition force. Jax's grin widened. This was a treat. 5 of them working together. No single cadet could stand against that. Your objective, Rorik continued, his voice dropping, is to hold this corridor, prevent anyone from getting through. Use any means necessary. He then turned, and his eyes finally landed on Alara. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with anticipation. It was clear this was no longer a standard exercise. This was a setup. Vance? Rorik barked, his voice laced with undisguised contempt. You're the runner. A wave of snickers and murmurs rippled through the remaining candidates. Sergeant Chun, standing beside Rorik, shifted uncomfortably. Gunny, that's not the protocol. 5 against 1. It's not a test, it's a beatdown. It's my test, Sergeant, Rorik retorted, his eyes locked on Alara. I want to see what happens when theory meets reality. I want to see what happens when your clever little answers run into a brick wall. Jax and his team exchanged gleeful, predatory looks. This was better than they could have imagined. It was a sanctioned hazing, a public humiliation delivered on a silver platter by the chief instructor himself. They cracked their knuckles, stretching their necks, their overconfidence radiating from them in palpable waves. Alara's expression did not change. She simply unclipped the chin strap of her helmet and refastened it, the click echoing in the sudden silence. She took off her outer jacket, leaving her in a simple t-shirt and tactical pants, the lean, wiry muscles of her arms and shoulders now visible. She rolled her neck once, a smooth, fluid motion. She didn't look at her 5 opponents. She didn't look at the jeering crowd. She looked down the dark, narrow mouth of the gauntlet. It was just a space, a problem with a set of variables, and she was ready to solve it. The crisis was no longer impending. It was here. The weight of every insult, every dismissal, every condescending glance had culminated in this moment. She was alone, outnumbered, and expected to fail. And for the first time since her arrival, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous ignited deep behind her calm, gray eyes. The buzzer blared, a harsh metallic scream that sliced through the tension. For a split second, everything was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Jax and his 4 cronies charged down the corridor, a wave of muscle and aggression, their boots thudding against the concrete floor. They were a pack of wolves, confident in their numbers, eager for the kill. They expected Alara to brace, to retreat, to cower. She did none of those things. Instead of meeting their charge head-on, she took 2 quick, lateral steps to her left and melted into the shadows of the first doorway. The maneuver was so swift, so unexpected, that it completely disrupted their momentum. They had been charging a target that was no longer there. They skidded to a clumsy halt, their formation broken, their eyes searching the gloom. Kale was the first to react. Seeing her in the doorway, he lunged, his hands reaching out to grab her. It was a classic mistake. Leading with his hands, overextending his balance. Alara didn't block. She didn't resist. She moved with him. Her right hand slapped the inside of his extended wrist, not to stop it, but to accelerate it, pulling him further off balance. Simultaneously, her left foot hooked behind his ankle. His own forward momentum became his enemy. He tumbled, not just falling, but being actively driven into the hard edge of the doorframe. The impact was sickeningly solid. As he fell, Alara's hand, fingers rigid, jabbed precisely into the cluster of nerves on the side of his neck. Kale's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, a dead weight. 1 down. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. The others stared for a microsecond, stunned by the sheer speed and efficiency of the takedown. That hesitation was all Alara needed. She exploded out of the doorway, not at the group, but at the nearest man, Ivan. He raised his arms in a clumsy boxer stance. She ignored them. She dropped her level, driving her shoulder into his midsection. It wasn't a tackle, it was a pivot point. As he grunted and folded forward, she used his body as a springboard, one hand on his back to launch herself upwards into a spinning elbow strike that caught Reese, who was moving in to support Ivan, squarely on the temple of his helmet. The crack of plastic on plastic echoed in the corridor. Reese staggered back, his senses scrambled, his vision swimming. While Reese was stunned, she finished with Ivan. As he struggled to straighten up, she drove the heel of her boot into the back of his knee. The joint hyperextended with a wet pop. Ivan screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and crumpled to the floor, clutching his leg. 2 down. In the observation room, the joking and jeering had died. There was only a stunned, absolute silence. Cadets who had been laughing moments before were now leaning forward, their eyes wide with disbelief. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik stood frozen in front of the monitors, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. His mind couldn't process what it was seeing. This wasn't brawling. This wasn't fighting. This was a disassembly. Back in the gauntlet, only 3 remained: Jax, the massive Olek, and the dazed Reese. They circled her now, their confidence shattered, replaced by a primal fear. They had come for a lamb and found a viper. Get her! Jax roared, his voice more panicked than commanding. Olek, the biggest of the 5, charged, bellowing like an animal. He swung a haymaker, a punch with enough force to knock a man out cold. Alara didn't try to block it. She swayed back, the fist whistling past her face by a scant inch. The motion was so fluid it looked like she was dancing. As Olek's momentum carried him past her, she drove 2 stiff fingers into the soft tissue just below his floating ribs. Olek's breath left him in a huge, whooshing gasp. He doubled over, momentarily paralyzed, his lungs refusing to draw air. She followed it with a hammer fist to the base of his skull. He fell forward onto his face, out cold. 3 down. Reese, still shaky, made a desperate grab for her. She spun inside his reach, her arm snaking around his neck. It wasn't a chokehold. Her other hand cupped the back of his head. With a sharp, brutal twist that was clearly designed to simulate a cervical dislocation, she torqued his entire body. He was thrown to the ground, landing in a heap. The instructor's monitors flashed with the signal for a kill strike. For down. Now it was just Jax. He stood alone in the corridor, surrounded by his fallen comrades. His face was a mask of fury, humiliation, and terror. All the bravado, all the arrogance had been stripped away. He was facing something he didn't understand. "Come on!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He charged, swinging wildly, putting all of his size and strength into every blow. Alara moved backwards, her feet light, her posture perfect. She was a matador and he was the raging bull. She didn't attack. She just evaded. His punches met nothing but empty air. His kicks were clumsy and slow. He was exhausting himself, his movements becoming more ragged, his breathing turning into ragged sobs of frustration. He lunged one last time, a desperate, clumsy tackle. This was the opening she had been waiting for. She sidestepped, and as he blundered past, her hand shot out and grabbed the collar of his uniform. She dropped her weight, pulling him down and forward. Using his own mass against him, she spun, executing a perfect hip throw. For a man of his size, the sight of him flying through the air was breathtaking. He landed on his back with a force that knocked the wind out of him. Before he could even register what had happened, she was on him. She didn't punch him. She didn't strike him. She simply settled onto his chest, one knee pinning his arm, her hands finding a grip on his throat. She didn't apply pressure. She just held him there, her calm, gray eyes looking directly into his terrified ones. He struggled, bucking and thrashing, But her position was perfect, her control absolute. He was a fly caught in a spider's web. He stopped struggling. He lay there, panting, defeated. The fight was over. All 5 opponents were neutralized. The total elapsed time since the buzzer had sounded was 87 seconds. Alara slowly released her grip, stood up, and brushed the dust from her pants. She walked calmly towards the end of the gauntlet, her breathing even, her expression as placid as it had been at the start. The silence that filled the kill house was more profound than any noise. It was a silence of shock, of awe, and of a fundamental, violent recalibration of reality. The girl they had mocked, the woman they had dismissed, was not just competent. She was lethal. She was something else entirely. And no one, least of all Gunnery Sergeant Rorik, had any idea what that was. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik moved as if in a trance. He pushed past the stunned cadets clustered around the monitors and stalked out of the observation room. His face a thunderous mask of disbelief and confusion. He strode into the gauntlet, the air still tasting of sweat and adrenaline. The scene was one of carnage. For cadets were being attended to by medics, groaning and dazed. Jax was sitting up against a wall, staring into space, his face pale with shock. Rorik ignored them all. His eyes were fixed on Alara, who was standing at the far end of the corridor, calmly sipping from a water bottle. There was not a scratch on her. She wasn't even breathing heavily. He stopped a few feet from her, his big frame casting a long shadow. The entire facility had fallen silent, everyone waiting to see what he would do. He had publicly set her up for failure and humiliation. She had responded with a display of martial prowess so far beyond the scope of their training that it bordered on the supernatural. "Report," he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Alara lowered her water bottle. "Objective complete, Gunnery Sergeant." "That's not what I asked," Rorik snapped, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "I asked you to report." "What was that?" "That was not standard CQC protocol. That was not anything we teach here. I saw joint manipulation, nerve strikes, and blade hand techniques designed for one purpose only, to kill." "Where did you learn it?" Alara met his furious gaze without flinching. Her calm was an impenetrable wall. "I've had other training. I'm not asking about your last posting's self-defense class, Vance." Rorik's voice rose to a roar. "I want a unit. A program name. Now." He was losing control, his entire worldview upended by this quiet, unassuming woman. He had built his career on the ability to read people, to identify their strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. With her, he had been catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong. Before Alara could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Gunny." Commander Thorne stepped out of the shadows of the kill house entrance. He was a man who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of calm authority. He wasn't attached to the training cadre. His presence at the facility was an unspoken mystery. He wore the rank of a full commander, but his uniform bore no unit patches, no identifying insignia. He was a ghost in the machine. Rorik turned, startled. "Commander, this is a training matter." "It's a personnel matter now," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command. He walked past Rorik and stopped in front of Alara. He looked at her not with shock, but with a weary sort of recognition. "You were instructed to maintain a low profile, Echo." The name hung in the air, meaningless to the cadets but causing a visible reaction among the senior instructors. Rorik's eyes widened slightly. Echo was a call sign he'd heard whispered in intelligence briefings, always in connection with operations that officially never happened. Black Ops. Wet work. Rorik's face hardened. "Sir, with all due respect, I need to know who is in my training cycle." "Echo isn't an answer." Thorne gave a long, slow sigh, as if Rorik's demand was a bureaucratic annoyance. He looked back at the gunnery sergeant. "Her file is designated Onyx level, sealed by a direct order you don't have the clearance to question. But you're right. You deserve to know what you're dealing with." He paused, letting the weight of the moment build. Have you ever heard of Project Chimera? Gunnery Sergeant? The name hit the room like a physical blow. A wave of murmurs spread through the instructors. Project Chimera. It was the ultimate bogeyman story. A ghost story the old hands told to scare the new intelligence officers. A defunct, black-budget program from the height of the last conflict. The goal was to create the perfect solo operative, a ghost, who could be inserted anywhere in the world and function with lethal autonomy. They took prodigies, orphans mostly, and raised them in a closed system, training them in every discipline imaginable. Multiple languages, every form of armed and unarmed combat, infiltration, sabotage, psychological warfare. They were supposed to be myths, urban legends. No one had ever actually seen one. Rorik stared at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time. The quiet demeanor wasn't weakness. It was discipline. The unassuming physique wasn't a flaw. It was designed not to draw attention. The analytical mind wasn't a substitute for grit. It was the core of a terrifyingly efficient weapon. Every piece of data he had misread now clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They were shut down, Rorik whispered, the words catching in his throat. Years ago, a congressional review. The project was decommissioned. Thorne corrected him gently. The assets were not. They were reassigned, integrated. Sometimes they need recalibration, a refresher on how to work within a team structure before a new assignment. He gestured vaguely at Alara. She's here to relearn how to be a soldier, not an assassin. The reveal was complete. Alara Vance was not a cadet. She was not a recruit. She was a living legend, a product of a program so secret and so ruthless that most of the military didn't believe it had ever existed. She was here not because she was weak, but because she was too dangerous, too conditioned for solitude, to be deployed without this reset. The brutal hazing Rorik had engineered was like a child throwing a rock at a tank. Rorik looked from Thorne to Alara, his face ashen. He saw the systematic takedowns in the gauntlet not as a fight, but as a diagnostic checklist. She had assessed each threat, identified the most efficient method of neutralization, and executed it without passion or malice. It was the work of a surgeon, a very, very deadly surgeon. He had mocked a weapon that could have dismantled his entire command structure without breaking a sweat. The silence in the kill house was no longer one of shock. It was one of pure, unadulterated fear and awe. The aftermath of the revelation was a profound and immediate shift in the facility's social ecosystem. The atmosphere around Alara changed overnight. The cadets, who had once treated her with a mixture of pity and contempt, now gave her a wide berth. Their whispers were no longer mocking but filled with a hushed, nervous reverence. They told and retold the story of the gauntlet, each retelling embellishing her speed and precision until she sounded less like a human and more like a force of nature. They no longer saw a quiet, awkward girl. They saw a ghost in their midst. Jax and his crew were the most transformed. They emerged from the infirmary, bandaged and humbled. Kale's arm was in a sling. Ivan limped heavily on a sprained knee, and Jax's throat was covered in dark bruises. The swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen, haunted silence. The next day, in the corridor leading to the mess hall, Jax saw Alara approaching. He froze, his body tensing as if expecting a blow. His friends flattened themselves against the wall. Alara's path was unobstructed. She walked past them, her gaze straight ahead, offering no sign that she even recognized them. As she passed, Jax, without thinking, gave a short, stiff nod. It was an involuntary gesture of deference, an acknowledgement of a hierarchy that had been brutally and irrevocably established. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The true measure of respect, however, came from Gunnery Sergeant Rorik. He was a man defined by his rigid principles and his pride. The revelation of Alara's identity had been a direct blow to both. For 2 days he avoided her, his orders delivered through Sergeant Chen, his gaze always directed elsewhere. He was wrestling with his own colossal misjudgment. He rewatched the footage from the gauntlet a dozen times, each viewing peeling back another layer of his own ignorance. He saw the feints, the weight shifts, the subtle manipulations of his opponent's balance. He saw the cold, detached calculus in her eyes. On the third day, the training module was long-range marksmanship. The cadets were on the 500-meter line, firing from a prone position. The wind was tricky, gusting unpredictably across the range. Rorik walked the line, his critiques as harsh as ever, a man trying to reassert his authority in a world that no longer felt stable. "Breathe, Diaz. You're snatching the trigger like you're stealing a purse. Adjust for windage, Miller. That's a 10-mile-an-hour gust, not a summer breeze." He reached Alara's position. She lay perfectly still behind her rifle, a part of the landscape. Her breathing was a slow, steady rhythm, timed to the natural pauses between heartbeats. He stopped behind her, saying nothing. He just watched. She didn't seem to notice his presence. Her focus was absolute, a straight line connecting her eye, the scope, and the distant target. She fired. The recoil was a slight, controlled nudge against her shoulder. She worked the bolt with fluid efficiency, ejected the spent casing, and chambered a new round. She fired again, and again. 5 shots in total, each one sent downrange with the same unnerving calm. Rorik raised his binoculars and focused on her target. He had expected excellence. He was not prepared for what he saw. There were not 5 holes in the paper. There was one single, ragged hole slightly larger than a single round, dead in the center of the bullseye. It was a group so tight it was functionally impossible, a testament to a level of skill that defied the laws of ballistics and human error. He lowered the binoculars slowly. The other cadets were struggling, their shots scattered across the paper by the wind. Hers were perfect. She had not just compensated for the wind. She had predicted its every shift and eddy. He cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the relative quiet of the firing line. "Vance!" She turned her head just enough to look at him, one eye still squinting as if looking through the scope. She waited. This was the moment. He could have given a curt nod and walked away. He could have offered a grudging compliment. Instead, he did something else. He offered the only currency he truly valued, a challenge directed at a peer, not a subordinate. "After the rest of these clowns are done," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of its usual mockery. "You're with me. We're going to run the Advanced Sniper Qualification course, the one for instructors. I want to see how you handle the moving targets at 1,000 meters." It was not an order. It was an invitation. It was his admission of her superiority. In his world, there was no higher form of respect. He was not just acknowledging her skill. He was seeking to learn from it. He turned and walked away before she could answer, the rigid set of his shoulders communicating a profound, unspoken apology. Alara watched him go, then turned back to her rifle, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The mockery had ended. Respect had been earned. The night was deep and quiet at the Aegis facility. A heavy blanket of silence lay over the barracks, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of sleeping cadets and the distant hum of a generator. Most were lost in an exhausted sleep, their bodies aching, their minds processing the day's brutal lessons. But in Barrack C, one bunk was empty. Alara Vance was not in her bed. She moved through the darkened corridors of the base with a silence that was absolute, her footsteps making no sound on the cold concrete. She walked not like a soldier, but like a shadow given form. She arrived at the main armory, a heavy steel door secured by a keypad lock. The door was supposed to be sealed after 2,000 hours. But Rorik had left a message with Sergeant Chen. "Vance has full access," she keyed in the code, and the heavy door hissed open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled sharply of gun oil, solvent, and cold steel. Racks of weapons stood in perfect, silent rows under the low, yellow glow of the utility lights. This was a place of purpose, a library of deadly tools. For Alara, it was a place of peace. She retrieved her assigned service rifle, the same one she had used on the range that day, and carried it to a brightly lit workbench. She began to field strip the weapon, her hands moving with a familiar, ingrained grace. It was a ritual she had performed thousands of times with dozens of different weapon systems. The rifle did not need cleaning. It was immaculate, a reflection of her own meticulous nature. But the act itself was a form of meditation. The soft snick of the retaining pins being pushed through, the smooth slide of the bolt carrier group out of the upper receiver, the metallic scrape of the firing pin being removed. Each component was laid out on the clean cloth in its proper order, a small mechanical constellation. She worked without thought, her mind quiet, her focus entirely on the physical task. It was a way of centering herself, of reaffirming the one constant in her chaotic life, the relationship between a warrior and her tools. The armory door hissed open again. Alara did not startle. She had heard the footsteps approaching from 30 yards away. She knew who it was. Gunnery Sergeant Rorik entered, closing the door quietly behind him. He did not speak. He carried a small wooden box. He walked over to a different workbench, set the box down and opened it. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was a heavy, old-fashioned .45 caliber pistol, its blued finish worn to a soft gray at the edges from years of carry. It was his personal sidearm, a relic he was permitted to keep by special dispensation. He began his own ritual. He broke the pistol down with the slow, practiced movements of a man who knew the weapon more intimately than he knew himself. For a long time, the only sounds in the armory were the quiet, precise clicks and scrapes of two master craftsmen at work. They toiled in a shared, comfortable silence. There was no rank in this room, no animosity, no past misjudgments. There were only two professionals, speaking a common, unspoken language of care, precision, and readiness. The air was thick with mutual, hard-won respect. Finally, as Rorik was wiping down the barrel of his pistol, he broke the silence. His voice was a low rumble, stripped of its usual abrasive edge. Project Chimera, I heard they shut that program down for good. It wasn't an accusation or a question. It was a statement, an opening. Alara seated the bolt carrier group back into her rifle. The sound of it locking into place was sharp and final. She looked across the room at him, her gray eyes reflecting the low light. Her expression was, as always, unreadable. Some things don't stay shut down, Gunnery Sergeant, she said, her voice neutral. They just get a new name. Rorik nodded slowly, his gaze distant, as if contemplating the deep, dark truths of the world he served. He understood. The monsters were never truly gone. They were just pointed in a new direction. He finished reassembling his pistol, the final click of the slide echoing her own. He walked over to her workbench. He held out his hand. Lying on his calloused, scarred palm was a small, worn whetstone, its surface smooth and dark from decades of use. It was the stone he used to keep the edge on his own combat knife. For your blade, he said simply. A good soldier is always sharp. A great one keeps a fine edge. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol, a passing of a torch from an old warrior to a new one. It was his final, complete acknowledgement of her status not as his student, but as his equal and perhaps, in the lethal world she came from, his superior. Alara reached out and took the stone. Her fingers, fine-boned but strong, brushed against his. Thank you, Gunny, she said. It was the first time she had used the familiar, respectful term. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the balance of their world. Rorik gave a single, curt nod, turned, and left the armory, leaving her alone once more. Alara stood for a long moment, the cool, smooth stone in her palm. She looked at its worn surface, then at her perfectly assembled rifle. The tests were over. The mockery was a distant memory. She had been seen and she had been understood. She slipped the whetstone into her pocket, the weight of it a small, solid comfort. The real work was about to begin. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to break, promising a new day.